They say you can't choose your family. What they don't tell you is that sometimes your family doesn't choose you either. I'm Linda Harris, and the day my mother slapped me in front of 80 wedding guests was the day I stopped being her daughter and became something far more dangerous. Let me take you back to my brother Tom's wedding. The champagne was flowing, the guests were celebrating, and I was about to lose everything I'd worked 20 years to build. Because standing at that microphone, my mother made a demand I never saw coming, hand over my penthouse. The one I bought with my own money, my own sweat, my own sacrifice. When I said no, her palm connected with my face so hard my earring flew across the marble floor. 80 people watched. No one moved. No one spoke. But here's what my mother didn't know. I had spent those 20 years learning that revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's best served with evidence, witnesses, and a phone call to someone she thought she'd buried decades ago. By the time I was done, the family empire wouldn't just crumble. It would burn. And I would light the match. My name is Linda Harris. I'm 48 years old, a licensed architect with my own firm in the city, and for the past 5 years, I've successfully avoided the town where I grew up. But today, I'm driving back down these familiar streets for my brother Tom's wedding, and every mile feels like a mistake. The last time I was here, my mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't need to come home anymore, Linda. We have Tom." I brought a housewarming gift for their newly renovated kitchen. She didn't even unwrap it, just set it on the counter and walked away. I left it there and drove the 3 hours back to my penthouse, the one I'd spent 20 years building my career to afford. That penthouse wasn't just 4 walls and a view, it was proof. Proof that I could make something of myself without their help, without their approval, without their love. Now I'm pulling into the country club parking lot, watching luxury cars glitter under string lights, and I can already feel the familiar tightness in my chest. The reception hall is massive, dripping in white roses and gold accents. 80 guests minimum, maybe more. I recognise half of them from my childhood, the mayor, the Rotary Club president families who've known the Harrises for generations. They're all here to celebrate Tom the golden boy who got his Harvard MBA on my parents' dime, who's marrying a sweet young woman named Emma in a ceremony that probably cost more than my first car. I slip inside and immediately scan for my name at the seating chart. There it is, tucked at table 12 in the back corner next to people I've never met. No place card at the family table. No surprise there. I smooth down my navy dress, the one I bought specifically because it's elegant, but not attention-grabbing, and make my way through the crowd. Guests smile politely as I pass the kind of smile you give someone you vaguely recognise, but can't quite place. Linda Harris, I want to say. The daughter. Remember me, Kyo. But I don't. It's my mother. Carol floats through the room like a queen holding court. Her silver hair is perfectly styled. Her champagne-coloured gown probably cost a fortune, and she's glowing with pride as she accepts congratulations. She walks right past me, doesn't even glance in my direction, just keeps moving her hand on the arm of some council member's wife, laughing at something I can't hear. Then I see Tom. My little brother, 30 years old now, handsome in his tuxedo, standing with his bride Emma at the centre of the room. I catch his eye and smile. He breaks away and comes over, arms outstretched. "Linda, you made it." The hug lasts maybe 2 seconds before he's pulled back toward Emma by an enthusiastic aunt. "Sorry, sis, duty calls," he says over his shoulder, and just like that, I'm alone again. I notice Emma watching me from across the room. She has kind eyes, and for a moment she looks like she wants to come say hello, but my mother appears at her elbow, steering her toward a cluster of important-looking guests. "You need to greet the donors, dear," I hear Carol say, and Emma throws me an apologetic glance before disappearing into the crowd. In the back corner near the bar, I spot a silver-haired woman I don't recognise. She's older, maybe early 60s, standing apart from the crowd, but watching everything intently. Her eyes meet mine for just a second, and something flickers in her expression, recognition maybe. But I've never seen her before. Must be one of Emma's relatives. My father Frank sits at the head table, looking distinguished in his suit. Our eyes meet once, just once. His expression is unreadable somewhere between sadness and resignation. Then he looks away, turning his attention back to his dinner plate. I was about to leave quietly the way I always did. But then Mom grabbed the microphone and her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. The microphone feedback screeched for just a second before my mother's voice filled the reception hall, smooth and practiced like she'd rehearsed this moment. "Good evening, everyone," Carol said, her smile radiant as she surveyed the crowd. "Today isn't just Tom's happy day, it's also a time for our family to reunite." Her eyes found mine again, and something in her expression made my stomach drop. My eldest daughter Linda has lived apart from us for too long, but tonight she's here and I think it's the perfect opportunity to talk about family. The room shifted its attention toward me. 80 pairs of eyes, maybe more, all turning to locate the daughter who'd been mentioned. I felt my face flush hot. This wasn't a toast. This was something else. Tom and Emma are starting their life together, my mother continued, her voice taking on a tone that sounded almost reasonable, almost loving. And like all young couples, they need a place to call home. Now, my Linda has a beautiful penthouse in the city. Absolutely stunning. 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, that gorgeous view of the skyline. She paused, letting the image settle in everyone's minds. That penthouse was purchased with family money we invested in Linda's education all those years ago. We gave her every advantage, sent her to the best schools, supported her dreams. My hands gripped the edge of the table. Where was she going with this? And now, Carol said, her smile widening, it's time for Linda to give back to family. Tom and Emma need that penthouse far more than Linda does, living all alone up there. It's time for her to do the right thing and hand over the keys to her brother. The room went completely silent. Not a clink of silverware, not a whisper. Just shocked, heavy silence as every guest processed what they had just heard. I could feel their stares turning judgmental, could practically hear their thoughts. The daughter who won't help her own brother. How selfish. How ungrateful. My legs felt weak as I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor louder than I intended. "Mom," I said, and I hated how my voice shook. "I bought that penthouse with my own money. I worked 20 years for it." Carol's laugh cut through the room like glass breaking. "Your own money, sweetheart. Did you forget who paid $40,000 for your college tuition? Who supported you through graduate school?" "I paid it all back," I said, my voice stronger now. "Every single dollar. I sent money home for 15 years, Mum. I have the bank statements to prove it." Her expression darkened, the mask of maternal sweetness slipping for just a moment. "That was your duty to family," she snapped. "That wasn't repayment, Linda. That was what you owed us, for raising you, for giving you a home, for everything we sacrificed, so you could have opportunities." I saw Tom at the head table, his face pale, making small gestures at our mother to stop, to please, just stop. But Carol wasn't looking at him. She was staring at me with an intensity I'd never seen before, and I realized with sudden, terrible clarity that this wasn't about the penthouse at all. This was about control, about putting me in my place, about making sure everyone in this room knew that I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her family. In the back corner, I caught a glimpse of the silver-haired woman. She'd pulled out her phone, holding it up slightly angled toward the stage. Was she recording this? "Tom and Emma deserve that home," my mother said, her voice dropping to something almost menacing. "So I'm asking you, Linda, in front of all these witnesses, all these people who've known our family for years, will you do the right thing?" Every eye in that room was on me, waiting, judging. I thought about the penthouse, my sanctuary, the place I'd furnished piece by piece, where I'd built my life, where I felt safe and proud and free. The place that proved I didn't need them. 2 words came out of my mouth, clear and final. I refuse. My mother's face contorted with something that looked like pure rage. She set the microphone down on the table with a sharp click and stepped down from the small stage, her heel striking the floor with purpose as she walked toward me. The crowd parted like water. I should have walked away. But I said the 2 words that changed everything. I refuse. And that's when my mother's hand flew across my face in front of everyone. The crack of the slap echoed through the silent hall. My head snapped to the side, and I felt my left earring tear free, the small gold hoop flying through the air and clattering across the marble floor, bouncing twice before settling near someone's shoe. 80 people frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the catering staff stood motionless by the kitchen doors. I touched my burning cheek, tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. Across the room, I heard Emma gasp a sharp intake of breath that broke the terrible silence. Tom grabbed his bride's arm, trying to pull her away, but Emma stood rooted to the spot, staring at me with horror written across her young face. Continuation from part 2. The previous part ended with, I touched my burning cheek, tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. Across the room, I heard Emma gasp a sharp intake of breath that broke the terrible silence. Tom grabbed his bride's arm, trying to pull her away, but Emma stood rooted to the spot, staring at me with horror written across her young face. Current context of Linda has just been slapped by her mother Carol in front of 80 wedding guests after refusing to hand over her penthouse to Tom and Emma. She's standing in the middle of the reception hall with a burning cheek, tasting blood in her mouth while her gold earring lies on the marble floor. She's in shock from the public humiliation and physical assault, experiencing both physical pain and crushing emotional devastation. The entire room is frozen in stunned silence. Linda is at a breaking point. She's been treated as invisible and unwanted by her family for years, but this public violence has crossed a line she never imagined. She's about to make her first decisive act of agency by walking out, though she doesn't yet know that someone has been documenting everything or that help is coming from an unexpected source. Nay! The metallic taste of blood spread across my tongue as I stood there, my cheek throbbing where my mother's hand had connected. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight in my chest, the humiliation that burned hotter than any physical wound. 80 people stared at me like I was a specimen under glass, and not one of them moved to help. Not one voice rose in my defense. My earring lay on the floor about 6 feet away, the small gold hoop resting against the polished black shoe of someone I didn't recognize. I walked toward it, my legs somehow still working despite feeling disconnected from my body. As I bent down, my hands trembling so badly I nearly couldn't grasp it, I caught sight of my mother standing exactly where she'd struck me. Her chest was heaving, her face flushed, but there was no remorse in her eyes. Only righteous anger, as if I were the one who'd done something unforgivable. I closed my fingers around the earring and straightened up slowly, deliberately. When I stood at my full height again, I looked around the room, one last time. My father still sat at the head table, his face buried in his hands. The silver-haired woman in the back corner was looking down at her phone now, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Emma's face was pale, her hand pressed against her mouth. Then, I turned and walked toward the exit. My heels made sharp, rhythmic clicks against the marble floor, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The crowd parted wordlessly as I approached, creating a path like I was something contagious, something to be avoided. No one spoke. No one whispered. They just watched. I was almost to the double doors when I heard footsteps running behind me. "Sis Linda, wait!" Tom's voice cracked slightly as he caught up to me in the hallway outside the reception hall. "Please, just stop for a second." I stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. When I finally did, my little brother looked stricken, his face red and his eyes glassy. Mum's just up, he said, the words tumbling out quickly. You know how she is when she doesn't get her way. She'll calm down and tomorrow we can all talk about this reasonably and... No, Tom! My voice came out steadier than I expected. You don't know how she is. You've never had to know. But I do. What's that supposed to mean? He looked genuinely confused and that somehow made it worse. It means I'm done. I turned toward the parking lot, my keys already in my hand. Linda, come on, it's my wedding day. I kept walking. Behind me, I heard Tom calling my name one more time, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. Through the windshield, I could see Tom standing alone in the parking lot under the string lights, looking lost and young and completely unaware of what our family had done to me over the course of decades. I drove back to the hotel on autopilot, barely registering the roads or the other cars. When I finally parked and made it up to my room, I collapsed onto the bed and reached for my phone. David. I needed to call David, my lawyer friend from the city, the one person I trusted with things like this. My fingers hovered over his contact information. Before I could press dial, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. The message was short and impossible. I saw everything. I have the video. Meet me at Riverside Cafe tomorrow 9 a.m. Aunt June. My breath caught in my throat. Aunt June. My father's younger sister, the one who'd been cut out of the family 20 years ago for marrying a carpenter instead of a doctor, or lawyer, or someone deemed acceptable by the Harris standards. I hadn't seen her since I was in my 20s, hadn't even known she still lived in the area. The family never spoke about her as if she'd been erased from existence for the crime of choosing love over status. And she'd been at the wedding. Somehow, she'd been there. And she had a video. My hands were still shaking as I stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from shock. Evidence. Someone had actually documented what my mother had done. I wasn't alone in this. Someone had witnessed it, had seen it for what it was, and was reaching out to help. I stared at the message for a full minute. Then I typed back, "I'll be there." I didn't know it yet, but that video would be the beginning of everything. Continuation from part 3. The previous part ended with, I stared at the message for a full minute. Then I typed back, "I'll be there." I didn't know it yet, but that video would be the beginning of everything. Current context of Linda is alone in her hotel room the night after being publicly slapped by her mother at Tom's wedding. She's physically and emotionally shattered, her cheek still throbbing dried blood on her lip, her gold earring clutched in her hand. She's just received a mysterious text from Aunt June, her father's sister, who was cut out of the family 20 years ago, claiming to have video evidence of the slap. Linda is experiencing a mixture of shock, cautious hope, and confusion. She didn't even know June was at the wedding, and she hasn't seen her aunt in 2 decades. She's agreed to meet June tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at Riverside Cafe. Linda is emotionally vulnerable, but also beginning to feel the first stirrings of something like determination. For the first time, someone is offering to stand with her instead of against her. She spent a sleepless night processing the humiliation and is now driving to meet the aunt she barely remembers, unsure what to expect, but desperately needing an ally. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face contorted with rage, felt the sting of her palm across my cheek, heard the awful silence of 80 people who chose to do nothing. By the time dawn broke through the hotel curtains, I'd given up on rest entirely and was already showered and dressed. My hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't quite bring myself to drink. Riverside Cafe was a small place on the edge of town, the kind of spot locals went to for breakfast before the tourists discovered it. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car watching the door and trying to remember the last time I'd seen Aunt June. I must have been in my mid-20s before she'd married the carpenter, and been exiled from family gatherings like some kind of scandal. I remembered her as younger then, with dark hair and a quick laugh that my mother always seemed to find too loud. At precisely 9 o'clock, I saw her. She stepped out of an older sedan, her silver hair catching the morning light, and even from across the parking lot I could see the sharpness in her eyes, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite wearing simple jeans and a cardigan. She spotted my car and raised her hand in a small wave. I met her at the cafe entrance, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other. Then June smiled, and it was warm and sad at the same time. 20 years, she said softly, and you're still as beautiful as ever. But your eyes are sadder. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected kindness. Aunt June. I managed my voice shakier than I wanted. You were at the wedding. She nodded and gestured toward a corner booth inside. Let's sit. I have a lot to tell you. Once we were settled with the coffee, neither of us was drinking. June folded her hands on the table and met my eyes directly. Emma invited me, she said. Sweet girl, your new sister-in-law. She was going through old family photos with your father a few months ago, saw a picture of me from before everything happened and asked who I was. Frank told her I was his sister who lived across town. Emma wanted to include me in the wedding because she's the kind of person who believes in family unity. June's smile turned bitter. She had no idea about our family's history. She just saw me as Grandpa's friendly relative and put me on the guest list. Your mother didn't even notice I was there until it was too late. I didn't see you, I said, remembering only that glimpse of a silver-haired woman in the back corner. I stayed out of the way. I was only there to support your father, even though he doesn't deserve it. June reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. But then your mother grabbed that microphone and I knew I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Not again. She turned the phone toward me. I recorded everything, Linda. I need you to watch this. My hands trembled as I took the phone. The video was queued up and ready to play. I pressed the arrow and watched it unfold again, my mother's voice sweet and venomous as she demanded I give up my penthouse. My own shaking voice as I refused the sharp crack of the slap that made me flinch even on the small screen. I watched my earring fly through the air, watched myself bend to pick it up, watched the crowd of frozen faces. Then came the part I hadn't seen because I'd already left. My mother turned back to the crowd and her face transformed. The anger melted away into something worse satisfaction. She picked up the microphone again, her voice light and almost cheerful. Don't worry, everyone, she said, smiling at the guests like she was sharing an inside joke. She'll come around. She always does. My daughter just needs to learn her place. A few guests laughed uncomfortably. Others nodded, murmuring agreement. I heard someone say, well, family is family. Another voice. Sometimes tough love is necessary. The video ended. I set the phone down carefully, my vision blurring with tears that had nothing to do with the physical pain of the slap, and everything to do with that casual contempt, that absolute certainty in my mother's voice that I was something to be trained, controlled, put in my place like a disobedient pet. I'm sorry you had to see that, June said quietly. But you needed to know what she said after you left. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. Why are you helping me after all this time, after the family cut you out? Because 20 years ago, I was treated the same way. June interrupted, her voice hardening. I fell in love with a man who built furniture with his hands instead of pushing papers in an office. A good man, an honest man. But he wasn't a doctor or a lawyer or someone who could advance the Harris family's precious reputation. Your mother called me a disgrace. She told me I was throwing away my breeding, that I was an embarrassment to everyone who shared my last name. June's jaw tightened. Your father, Frank, stood there and said nothing while Carol threw me out of a family dinner. Didn't defend me, didn't speak up, just sat there like a statue while his own sister was being destroyed. I tried to forget about all of them, tried to build a life with my husband and pretend that family didn't matter. But when I saw them do this to you, saw your father sit there silent again while his daughter was humiliated and assaulted, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. She reached across the table and gripped my hand, her fingers strong and steady. They don't get to define who you are, Linda. They don't get to take what you've built or make you feel small. And now we have proof. We have evidence of exactly who they are. I looked down at our joined hands, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not just pain or anger, but something else. Hope, maybe, or determination. There's something else, June said. She released my hand and pulled a thick manila envelope from her purse. Do you remember maybe 10 or 12 years ago you asked me to keep some documents safe for you? You said you didn't trust your mother to handle them properly. My breath caught. I did remember vaguely. I'd been sending money home regularly back then, and I'd asked June to keep copies of the bank statements and receipts, because something had felt off about the way my parents talked about their finances. I saved everything, June said, sliding the envelope across the table. Every receipt, every bank statement, every record of money you sent home with notes about what it was supposed to be used for. You wrote mortgage payment on most of them. Property tax help on others. I kept it all just like you asked. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and saw years of documentation, my own handwriting on deposit slips and money order receipts, proof of every dollar I'd sent back to help my family. Aunt June leaned closer and said something that made my heart race. I've been waiting 20 years to watch them fall, and I know exactly who can help us make that happen. Continuation from part 4. The previous part ended with, Aunt June leaned closer and said something that made my heart race. I've been waiting 20 years to watch them fall, and I know exactly who can help us make that happen. Current context of Linda is sitting in Riverside Cafe, with Aunt June having just watched the video of her mother slapping her and then dismissively telling guests, she'll come around. She's also just received a manila envelope full of financial documentation, bank receipts, and statements from 10-12 years ago when she was regularly sending money home to help with mortgage payments and other family expenses. Linda asked June to keep these safe at the time because she didn't trust her mother. Linda is transitioning from pure emotional devastation to something more focused. She's beginning to see that this might be more than just family dysfunction, that there might be actual wrongdoing she can prove. She's sitting with the years of financial records spread in front of her, feeling the first stirrings of purpose and agency. June has just told her she knows someone who can help them, and Linda is ready to find out who that person is and what they can do with this evidence. Who? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as I stared at the documents spread across the cafe table between us. June's expression shifted into something harder, more determined. David Chen. Do you remember him? The name hit me like a physical blow. David. Of course I remembered David. He'd been a legal assistant at Harris Construction 15 years ago, young and ambitious and genuinely good at his job. I remembered the day he'd been fired, the way my father had come home tight-lipped and furious, the way my mother had smiled with grim satisfaction. He was asking too many questions, Carol had said at dinner that night. Thought he could threaten us. Your father handled it. I helped him get back on his feet. I said slowly, the memory surfacing. David had called me after he'd been blacklisted from every firm in town, desperate and broke with a wife and infant daughter to support. I'd made some calls to colleagues in the city, written him a recommendation, helped him land a position with a small firm doing contract work. We'd stayed in loose touch over the years, occasional emails and holiday cards. He never forgot that, June said. And he never forgot what your parents did to him. Carol threatened his family, Linda, told him if he reported what he'd found, She'd make sure he never worked in this state again, that his wife would lose her teaching job, that they'd be destroyed. He had to choose between his principles and his family's survival. My stomach turned. What did he find? Accounting irregularities in the company books, money being moved around in ways that didn't make sense, payments to entities that didn't exist, financial records that didn't match up. June leaned forward. But here's what your parents didn't know. David made copies of everything before they fired him. He couldn't report it back then without destroying his family, but he kept the evidence, just in case. 2 hours later, I was sitting in David's modest office in the city, watching him spread 15-year-old financial documents across his desk with the careful precision of someone who'd been waiting a long time for this moment. He looked older than I remembered, his dark hair now streaked with grey at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and focused. I always knew something was deeply wrong with Harris Construction's finances, he said, pulling out page after page of copied ledgers and bank statements. But I was missing a crucial piece. I could see money moving, but I couldn't prove where it was really coming from, or where it was going. He looked up at June, who was pulling the receipts and bank statements from the manila envelope. Until now. June handed him the records I had sent home over the years, each one carefully annotated in my own handwriting. 4 mortgage payments, property tax assistance, home repair fund, thousands of dollars year after year sent with specific purposes clearly documented. David's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up digital copies of old Harris family bank records he'd somehow managed to access. Look at this, he said, turning his monitor so I could see. Every deposit you made for mortgage payments, none of it went to the mortgage company. Watch. He highlighted the trail. It went into a separate account, and from there, he clicked through several screens, straight into something called the Tom Harris Trust Fund. I felt the blood drain from my face. A trust fund, established when your brother turned 18, David confirmed. He pulled up more documents. Officially funded by family contributions, which sounds generous and normal, but in reality, he gestured at my stack of receipts. Over $300,000 of your money redirected into your brother's personal fund over 15 years. My hands started shaking. But I signed loan agreements with my parents. 20 years ago, when I bought my penthouse, they loaned me money for the down payment. I have a promissory note. Let me guess, David interrupted gently. You've been paying them back through these family contributions ever since. I nodded mutely. And they never gave you a receipt confirming you'd paid off the loan, never formally discharged the debt. When I shook my head, David's expression darkened. That's because they were using your repayment money for something else entirely. According to my calculations, you've paid back that loan twice over, but they kept the promissory note active so they could continue to claim you owed them, could continue to hold it over your head while simultaneously using your money to build your brother's wealth. Chai. The cafe coffee I'd drunk earlier threatened to come back up. I sent money home to help them pay off the house, I whispered. Every month, for years, I sent them money because they said they were struggling, because Dad said the company had rough years, because Mom said they might lose the house. It was a lie, David said flatly. The mortgage was paid off 9 years ago. The company was always profitable. They didn't need your money. They wanted it. And this... He tapped the trust fund documents. This constitutes fraud. They accepted loans from you under false pretenses, claiming financial hardship that didn't exist, and diverted the funds for purposes you never authorized. June placed her hand on my shoulder as I struggled to process what I was hearing. 15 years. 15 years of sacrifice, of living modestly, so I could help my family, of feeling guilty every time I bought something nice for myself, because I knew my parents needed help. And it had all been a lie. David looked at me with something like pity and said, Linda, there's more, and you're not going to like it. Your father's signature is on every single one of these documents. my father's signature, neat authoritative loops on every page, on the trust fund establishment papers, on the loan agreements that were never properly discharged, on the records showing my money being redirected month after month, year after year, all of it bearing Frank Harris's careful handwriting, his legal authorization, his consent. I pulled out my phone before I could talk myself out of it. I couldn't call my mother. Carol would just scream at me, blame me, twist everything into proof of my disloyalty. But my father had always been different, quieter, the one who'd occasionally look at me with something that might have been regret. Maybe he would explain. Maybe there was something I was missing. The phone rang 5 times long enough that I started to think he wouldn't answer. Then I heard the click of connection and my father's voice, weary and resigned. Linda. Just my name. Not a question, not a greeting. Like he'd been expecting this call. Did you know? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Did you know about the trust fund? Did you know Mom was using my money to build a fund for Tom? There was silence on the other end, but I could hear him breathing. David was watching me intently, and June had moved closer, her hand resting supportively on the back of my chair. Finally, Frank sighed a long exhale that seemed to carry decades of weight. 10 full seconds of silence stretched between us before he spoke. So you know now. Not a denial, not even a hint of surprise, just weary confirmation. So you knew, I said, and I heard my voice crack. For 15 years you knew. You watched me send money home every month, watched me sacrifice, and you never told me the truth. You let me believe you needed help when you were just stealing from me. Things are more complicated than you think, Linda. His voice was quiet, almost defeated. Complicated how the anger was rising, now hot and sharp in my throat. You signed those papers, Dad. Your signature is on every single document. You agreed to this. You participated in it. Another pause, shorter this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed somehow, taken on a strange quality I couldn't quite identify. Do you trust me? The question was so unexpected, so absurd given everything I'd just learned that I almost laughed. No, I said, the word bitter on my tongue. I don't trust you anymore. I heard him take a shaky breath. I understand, but one day you will. I can't say more over the phone, Linda. Just remember one thing. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never wanted you to be hurt. Then the line went dead. He'd hung up on me. I stared at my phone, confusion warring with anger in my chest. What kind of answer was that? What did he mean? One day I'd trust him. How could he claim he never wanted me hurt when he'd been signing the papers that enabled my mother to steal from me for 15 years? That was strange, June said softly. David was leaning forward now, pulling the documents back toward him, his eyes scanning the pages with renewed intensity. He flipped through several sheets, then stopped on one that looked like an internal memo from Harris Construction. His finger traced something written in tiny handwriting along the margin of the page. Linda, he said slowly, look at this. I moved closer. There, in my father's distinctive handwriting, barely visible in the margin, were 5 words, this is wrong. Carol insists. David flipped to another document, this one showing a transfer of funds from my account to the trust fund. Again, margin notes in my father's hand. Forgive me, Linda. He wrote notes on the documents, I whispered. Not just notes, David said, his voice taking on an edge of excitement tinged with uncertainty. He documented his objections. Look at the dates. These margin notes appear on documents throughout the entire 15-year period. It's like he was leaving a trail. David looked up at me, his expression troubled. The question is why, if he disagreed with what was happening, why didn't he stop it? Why just leave cryptic notes in margins that no one would see? June leaned over to examine the pages. Unless he wanted someone to see them eventually. David sat back in his chair, staring at the documents spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. That phone call, he said slowly. The way he asked if you trusted him. the way he said you'd understand someday. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp with dawning realization. Unless he's been setting them up all along. I didn't understand what Dad meant, but David did. He stared at the documents again and muttered, Unless he's been setting them up all along. David's theory about my father hung in the air, unanswered, too complex and strange to unpack in that moment. But over the next week, as we compiled everything into a comprehensive file, the question nagged at me. Why would Frank leave those notes if he wasn't planning for someone to find them? Eventually, I was still wrestling with that puzzle when Tom called 7 days after the wedding. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. Sis, Mum wants you to come to dinner at my place. Just family. We can talk about everything calmly without all the wedding chaos. I almost said no immediately, but David, who was sitting across from me in my penthouse when the call came, held up his hand and nodded encouragingly. We'd discussed this possibility. My family would try to control the narrative, try to force me into submission through another confrontation. This could be our opportunity. Okay, I said into the phone. When? Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Tom sounded surprised that I'd agreed so easily. After I hung up, David pulled out a small USB drive he'd been preparing. Everything's on here, he said. The video from June, the financial documents, the trust fund records, and the letter you wrote to Tom. I've got backup copies of everything, of course. The letter had taken me 3 drafts to get right. I'd wanted Tom to understand that I wasn't attacking him, that he'd been as much a victim of our parents' manipulation as I had been, even if he'd benefited from it. Tom, I'm not angry at you. You didn't know, but you deserve to know the truth before you accept that penthouse. Mum and Dad built your life on my sacrifice and they never told you. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. I still love you, little brother. June had read it and cried. If Emma's half as decent as I think she is, she'd said, she'll make sure he watches every second of what's on that drive. Now I was standing on Tom and Emma's front porch, the USB drive a small weight in my jacket pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs. Emma opened the door and I saw concern flash across her face before she masked it with a polite smile. Linda, come in. The dining room was set formally like this was a special occasion rather than an ambush. My parents sat at the head of the table, my mother's posture rigid and triumphant, my father's eyes fixed on his water glass. Tom and Emma sat across from where I was directed to sit, Tom looking uncomfortable, Emma watching me with those worried eyes I'd noticed at the wedding. We made it through the first course in near silence, before my mother finally spoke. Have you thought about it, Linda? I let my shoulders slump slightly, kept my voice soft and defeated. I'm sorry for being disrespectful at the wedding. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way in front of all those guests. The words tasted like ash, but I forced them out. My mother's expression shifted to something like satisfaction, though she tried to hide it behind concern. Good. I'm glad you've come to your senses. So, you agree to transfer the penthouse? She pressed, unable to help herself. I nodded, slowly, not meeting anyone's eyes. If that's what family needs, then I'll do it. Across the table, Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I saw guilt written plainly across his face. But he said nothing. Emma's hand found his under the table, squeezing it, her eyes still on me. My father hadn't spoken at all, hadn't even looked up from his plate. In the silence, I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I stood up carefully, reaching for my jacket. I should go. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. My hand closed around the USB drive in my pocket, and I pulled it out as I moved toward Tom's end of the table. Instead of handing it to him subtly or pretending to drop it, I placed it deliberately on the table directly in front of my brother. Little brother, I said quietly, and everyone at the table went still. There's one more thing I want you to see. After you watch this, you'll understand why I did what I did. Tom stared at the small black drive like it was a live grenade. What is it? The truth, I said simply, Whether you watch it or not is your choice. I looked at Emma then, and she met my eyes steadily. I saw intelligence there and integrity, and I felt a small surge of hope that Tom had married someone strong enough to make him face reality. My mother started to stand. "What is that? What did you give him?" But I was already walking toward the door, my hand steady on the knob. "Good night, everyone. Thank you for dinner." I heard my mother's voice rising behind me as I stepped out into the cool evening air, demanding that Tom give her whatever I'd left, insisting it was probably lies and manipulation. But I also heard Emma's voice, firm and calm, saying, "We'll look at it together, Carol, in private." I drove home, with my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, wondering if I'd just made everything better or infinitely worse. David had assured me the contents of that drive were damning enough that no reasonable person could ignore them. Now we'd find out if my brother was reasonable or if he'd choose willful blindness to protect the comfortable lie he'd been living. That night, Tom plugged in the USB, and when he saw what was inside his hand started shaking. He looked at his wife Emma and whispered, "Oh God, what have they done?" I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my penthouse balcony with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, watching the city lights blur and refocus as my eyes grew tired. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would jump, but it was just emails, just spam, just anything except what I was waiting for. Would Tom call? Would he delete everything without watching? Would my mother have somehow convinced him to throw the drive away? Unopened. At 11:37, my phone finally rang, with Tom's name on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before I could make myself answer. "Sis." His voice was wrecked, barely recognizable. "I need to know. Is it all true?" I closed my eyes. "Yes." I heard him take a shaky breath, and then I heard crying in the background. Not Tom. Emma. "We watched the video first," Tom said, and his voice cracked on the word watched. Emma kept saying, pause it, but I told her we needed to see all of it. The slap. "And then after you left, when Mum took the microphone again and said that you'd come around, that you just needed to learn your place, and everyone laughed." He was crying now too, I realised. My 30-year-old brother was crying. "Emma asked me if I knew. If I knew Mum had done that to you. I told her I knew our family always favoured me, but I didn't think they'd do that. I didn't think they were capable of something so cruel." "Tom," I started, but he wasn't finished. Then we opened the financial files, the trust fund documents. His voice had gone hollow now, shocked into numbness. $300,000. From you. Every month you sent money home, and I thought you were just being generous, just being a good daughter, and the whole time they were taking it and putting it in an account for me. I heard papers rustling. "There's a spreadsheet here, Linda. Every single payment you made tracked and redirected. My Harvard tuition, my apartment in grad school, the down payment on this house Emma and I are living in right now. It all came from you." "I didn't know either," I said quietly. "Not until a few days ago." "How could they do this?" Tom's voice rose, anger breaking through the shock. "How could they lie to both of us for 15 years? How could Dad sign these papers knowing what they were doing?" I thought about my father's margin notes, the cryptic phone call, David's theory that I still didn't fully understand. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still trying to figure that out myself." "Emma read your letter out loud," Tom said, his voice softening. "The one where you said you're not angry at me, that I didn't know. But Linda, I should have known. I should have questioned why everything came so easily to me while you were working yourself to death. I should have wondered why Mum and Dad treated you like you were disposable. But you were their golden child," I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You weren't supposed to question it." "That's not good enough." Tom was crying again. "That's not good enough, and you know it. I was so wrapped up in my own life, so comfortable with the advantages I'd been given that I never stopped to think about what it cost you. I'm so sorry, sis. I'm so sorry I didn't see it." The apology was something, but It wasn't what I needed from him. Not yet. Tom, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about hurt feelings or family dynamics anymore. What they did is fraud. It's illegal, and I'm not going to let it go. Silence on the other end, long enough that I thought he might hang up. I know you didn't know what they were doing. I continued, my voice steady. But now you do, and you have to decide, are you going to stand with them or stand with the truth? More silence. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Each moment of hesitation told me everything I needed to know about where my brother's loyalties ultimately lay, about whether the comfortable life our parents had built for him was more important than, Tom, we're standing with the truth. Emma's voice came through the phone, clear and firm. I heard movement like she'd taken the phone from Tom's hand. Linda, this is Emma. I don't know you very well, but I know right from wrong. What your parents did to you is unconscionable. And what they did to Tom, lying to him about where his advantages came from, making him complicit without his knowledge, that's unforgivable too. Emma's right, Tom said, his voice stronger now. He'd taken the phone back. I'm standing with you, Linda. Whatever you need to do, whatever comes next, I'm with you. And if that means our parents face consequences for what they've done, then that's what needs to happen. I told Tom, I know you didn't, but now you do. And you have to decide, are you going to stand with them or stand with the truth? He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. Tom's eventual yes that night had been the turning point, but the 4 weeks that followed were what transformed my anger into action. David had taken my testimony and June's evidence to the State Financial Crimes Unit, where it turned out an investigation had already been quietly underway for months. They'd been waiting for the right moment, the right evidence, the right witness willing to go on record. I became that witness. Now, my penthouse was filled with carefully selected guests, all of whom believed they were here for my announcement of a charitable foundation to support young women in architecture. The irony wasn't lost on me. Local press had set up cameras in the corner. Mayor Richardson stood near the windows making small talk with the head of the Chamber of Commerce. And there, near the entrance, stood my parents. My mother wore pearl earrings and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd been cool, but civil when she arrived, nodding at acquaintances playing the role of proud mother, supporting her daughter's philanthropic venture. I'd caught her looking around my penthouse with an expression of satisfied calculation, probably already mentally redecorating for Tom and Emma. My father stood slightly apart from her, hands in his pockets, studying the floor-to-ceiling windows with an unreadable expression. He hadn't looked at me directly since arriving. I was midway through my prepared remarks about supporting women in male-dominated fields when the doorbell rang. The timing was perfect, exactly as coordinated. I paused, smiled apologetically at my guests, and walked to the door. 2 men in dark suits stood in the hallway. Behind them, through the open elevator doors, I could see a black sedan parked illegally in front of my building, its government plates visible even from the 23rd floor. Ms. Harris, the taller one asked, though he clearly knew who I was. Yes? They held up badges. State Financial Crimes Unit. We're here for Mr. and Mrs. Frank Harris. I stepped aside and gestured them in. The room had gone absolutely silent, every conversation dying mid-sentence, as the 2 investigators entered. Their footsteps echoed on my hardwood floors. Mr. Frank Harris. Mrs. Carol Harris. The lead investigator's voice carried across the room with practiced authority. My parents turned my mother's face already draining of colour. We have a warrant to investigate financial fraud, tax evasion, and misuse of corporate funds related to Harris Construction. The press cameras that had been focused on me swiveled toward my parents. Guests backed away slightly, creating a clearing around my mother and father, like they were suddenly contagious. Mayor Richardson's mouth hung open, Someone's champagne glass slipped from their fingers and shattered on the floor. "This is outrageous," my mother hissed, but her voice shook. "On what grounds?" "We've been investigating Harris Construction for 6 months, ma'am," the investigator said calmly, pulling papers from his jacket. "Ms. Harris's testimony provided the evidence we needed to move forward with this warrant." He looked at me briefly, and I saw acknowledgement there. Respect, even. My mother's face contorted as she whirled toward me. "What have you done?" The composure she'd worn like armour since arriving cracked completely. "You vindictive, ungrateful—" "I told the truth, Mum," I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "You always taught me to be honest. Remember, to do the right thing, even when it's hard." Carol lunged toward me, but one of the investigators stepped smoothly between us. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us." It was my father's voice that cut through the chaos, quiet and heavy, with something I couldn't identify. "So it's finally over." Everyone turned to look at him. He wasn't angry, wasn't even surprised. He stood there with his shoulders slightly slumped, looking at the investigators with what appeared to be resignation. Or something else. Something that looked almost like relief. "Finally." I repeated the word escaping before I could stop it. What did he mean, finally over? Had he been waiting for this? But Frank didn't answer. He simply nodded to the investigators and began walking toward the door, his steps measured and calm while my mother continued to protest shrilly behind him. The guests parted like water, and I saw shock and judgment and fascination on their faces as they watched the Harris family empire crumble in real time. As the investigators led my parents toward the elevator, Carol was still screaming about lawyers and false accusations and family betrayal. But my father walked in silence, his head up, his expression almost peaceful. Just before he stepped into the elevator, he turned back. Our eyes met across my crowded penthouse, across 23 floors above the city, across decades of distance and pain and things left unsaid. As the investigators led my parents out, my father turned back and looked at me. And for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: relief. The morning after the investigators led my parents away, I woke to my phone vibrating with news alerts. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying that look in my father's eyes, the word he'd said, "finally." The local newspaper's website had already posted the story, with a headline I read 3 times before it felt real: "Prominent Harris family under investigation for financial fraud." The article detailed how Harris Construction's assets had been frozen pending investigation, how bank accounts were locked, how Frank and Carol Harris had been brought to the police station for questioning. They weren't arrested, not yet, but the piece made it clear the evidence was substantial. The reporter had somehow gotten quotes from unnamed sources describing systematic diversion of funds and exploitation of family members. By noon, it was all anyone in town was talking about. June texted me screenshots of Facebook posts from people we'd gone to high school with, people I hadn't thought about in decades, all suddenly experts on my family's dysfunction. The wealthy Harris family was living off their daughter's money. One post read with 47 comments beneath it. I turned my phone face down on the coffee table and tried to drink the tea that had gone cold in my hands. That's when Tom called. "You destroyed everything." His voice hit me like a physical blow before I'd even said hello. "Do you understand what you've done? Dad's company is going to go bankrupt. Our parents are going to lose the house. Our family is going to lose everything." I closed my eyes and forced myself to speak calmly. "Who destroyed the family, Tom? The people who lied and stole for 20 years, or the person who told the truth? They're still our parents." Tom's voice cracked. "They made mistakes, yes, but did you really have to go nuclear? Did you have to bring in the police? Do you really want them in jail?" "No," I said quietly. "I don't want them in jail. I want them to take responsibility for what they did. There's a difference." "There's no difference. The outcome is the same." He was crying now, I realised. My 30-year-old brother was crying on the phone like a child whose world had just collapsed. I don't know what to do, Linda. I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it, Tom. They have to fix it themselves, or face the consequences of not fixing it. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling sick and tired and more alone than I had at any point in this entire nightmare. I'd known Tom would struggle with this, would be torn between his loyalty to our parents and his newfound understanding of what they'd done. But hearing the anguish in his voice made me wonder if I'd lost my brother along with everything else. An hour later, my phone rang again, Emma's name on the screen this time. Linda? Her voice was soft, tentative. I know this is strange, but can I meet you alone? Tom doesn't know I'm calling. We met at the same cafe where I'd met Aunt June weeks ago, a place that was starting to feel like neutral ground in a war I hadn't asked to fight. Emma arrived carrying a small cardboard box, her face pale, her hands trembling as she set it on the table between us. This is $50,000 in cash, she said without preamble. Wedding gifts, I want to give it back to you. I stared at the box, then at her. Emma, I don't understand. Our wedding was funded by your money. The words came out in a rush like she'd been rehearsing them. The reception, the flowers, my dress, everything. I watched that video, Linda. I saw the spreadsheet showing every dollar you sent home, and I realised that every beautiful moment of my wedding day was built on your sacrifice, on your pain. She pushed the box toward me. So, I want to give it back. It's not enough, it's not even close to enough, but it's what I have. My throat tightened. Why would you do this? You didn't know. None of this is your fault. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Because for 6 months during our engagement, Carol kept comparing me to you. Every time I'd express an opinion or make a decision about the wedding, she'd say things like, a good daughter-in-law knows her place, or you're so humble and grateful, not like Linda, ungrateful and selfish. She painted you as this terrible person who'd abandoned the family, and I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. But then, I saw that video. Saw her slap you in front of everyone. Saw her smile afterward and say you'd come around, that you just needed to learn your place. And I realised I'd married into a family of monsters. Tom isn't a monster, I said quietly. No, Emma agreed, but he's not strong enough to stand up to them either. Not really. He says he's on your side, but when Carol called him yesterday crying, he went straight to their house. He's there right now, trying to comfort them, trying to fix everything. She looked at me with something like desperation in her eyes. You're the only decent person in this family, Linda. The only one with a spine. I pushed the box of money back toward her. Keep it. You and Tom are going to need it to start over away from them. Emma's face crumpled. That's what I'm afraid of. Tom wants to stay. He wants to support them through the investigation, help them fight the charges, stand by them, no matter what. She took a shaky breath. But I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can spend the rest of my life pretending that what they did was okay, or that family loyalty means covering up crimes. She looked at me with eyes full of pain. Am I a terrible person for thinking about leaving him? I refused to take the money. I told Emma, keep it. You and Tom will need it to start over away from them. And then she said something that broke my heart. Tom wants to stay with his parents, but I don't know if I can. Emma's heartbreak stayed with me for the next 3 days, like a weight I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about her sitting in that cafe trembling and torn between her principles and her marriage, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd destroyed more than just my parents' carefully constructed lies. Maybe I'd destroyed my brother's happiness too. The letter arrived on the 3rd day, delivered by regular mail in my mother's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was plain no return address, and when I opened it, there was only a single folded sheet of paper inside. Linda, please meet me. Alone, at St. Mary's Church noon tomorrow. I need to talk to you, Mum. I sat at my kitchen table staring at those words for 20 minutes. David called while I was still holding the letter and I told him about it. Don't go, he said immediately. Or if you do go, let me come with you. We don't know what she's planning. She's not planning anything, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. She's desperate, and this is between mother and daughter. Linda, I need to do this, David. I need to hear whatever she has to say. The next day, I drove to St. Mary's Church, the small stone building on the edge of town, where my family had attended services every Sunday when I was growing up. I hadn't been back since I'd left for college, but it looked exactly the same. Weathered stone walls, modest steeple, the ancient oak tree in the courtyard where children used to play after service. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cool dimness inside. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting coloured patterns across the worn wooden pews. The church was empty except for one figure sitting in the front pew, hunched over with her head bowed. My mother looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. Her hair, usually styled perfectly, hung limp around her face. She wore no makeup, and when she turned at the sound of my footsteps, I saw that her eyes were red and swollen, ringed with dark circles. You came, she said, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. I sat down one pew behind her, close enough to talk, but maintaining distance. What do you want to say? Carol turned to face me, more fully gripping the back of the pew with white-knuckled hands. Can you drop the complaint, please? Your father will go to prison. The company will be completely destroyed. Everything we've built for 40 years will be gone. The pleading in her voice might have moved me once. Now it just made me tired. And I'm supposed to pretend nothing happened, just let it all go and act like you didn't steal from me for 15 years. We were trying to help Tom. For Tom. Something inside me snapped, and suddenly all the rage I'd been carefully controlling came flooding out. What about me? Mum, was I even your daughter? My entire life, all I ever heard was Linda must sacrifice for her brother. Linda must understand. Linda needs to be grateful. Do you have any idea how invisible I felt in my own family? How worthless? Carol flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I was just trying to... You didn't mean to... My voice echoed off the church walls, too loud for this sacred space, but I couldn't stop. You slapped me in front of 80 people. You demanded I hand over my home like it was something you were entitled to. You stole my money, lied about why you needed it, and used it to build a trust fund for Tom, while I lived on ramen and worked overtime to make sure you wouldn't lose your house. I was standing now, though I didn't remember getting up. You stole 15 years of my life, Mum. 15 years I spent feeling guilty for having anything nice, for taking a vacation, for buying myself decent furniture, because I thought my family was struggling and needed my help. And it was all a lie. Linda, please. Carol reached toward me, but I stepped back. I sent money home every month with notes about what it was for. Mortgage payments, property taxes, home repairs, and you took it all and gave it to Tom. You let me believe I was helping my family, when really, you were just using me. How could you do that? How could you look at your own daughter and see nothing but a resource to exploit? Carol was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you, but Linda, we're still family. Your father is going to prison. Do you understand that he's going to lose everything? We're going to lose everything. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us? Forgive you. I stared at her, this woman who'd given birth to me, but had never really seen me as anything more than a tool to advance her golden child. I might have been able to forgive you if you'd ever acknowledged what you did was wrong, but even now sitting here begging me to save you, you're still making excuses. You're still saying it was all for Tom, like that makes it okay. Carol's face crumpled, and she lowered her head into her hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the church was her crying and the distant sound of birds outside. When she finally looked up at me again, there was something different in her expression. something that looked almost like resignation, or maybe defeat. And then my mother said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew. "We did it for Tom because he's not your real brother." The words hung in the air between us, impossible and yet somehow explaining everything. I felt my legs go weak and I sat down heavily on the pew, my hand gripping the smooth wood for support. "What?" The word came out barely above a whisper. Carol's face was a mess of tears and decades of buried pain. 25 years ago, your father had an affair with a woman who worked at Harris Construction. Her name was Michelle. I found out when she showed up at our house 8 months pregnant, saying Frank needed to take responsibility. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just stared at my mother as she continued, the words pouring out like she'd been holding them back for a lifetime. She gave birth to Tom, and then she disappeared, just walked away from the hospital and never came back. Didn't want to be a mother, she said. Didn't want the responsibility. Frank came to me begging. Carol's voice broke. He said, "If you don't help me, my son will go to an orphanage. Please, Carol, please help me fix this." "So you took him," I said numbly. "I legally adopted him when he was 3 days old. We put my name on his birth certificate as his mother. Frank's name was already there as father. We told everyone I'd given birth while we were travelling abroad, that it had been a difficult pregnancy and I'd needed special care. No one questioned it. No one knew the truth." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I raised Tom to preserve our family's honour, to keep Frank's reputation intact, to prevent the scandal that would have destroyed everything we'd built. But every single day I looked at that boy, I remembered your father's betrayal." The church seemed to spin around me. "Tom doesn't know." Carol shook her head violently. "No. We swore we'd take that secret to our graves. He believes I'm his biological mother. He has no idea." "So you raised him," I said slowly, my mind trying to piece it all together. "You raised your husband's illegitimate child, the living proof of his affair, and you showered him with love and money and every advantage, while my voice caught, while your actual daughter, your biological child, got nothing but criticism and demands and indifference. Because you look exactly like your father." The words exploded from Carol with shocking force. "Every time I looked at you, Linda, I saw Frank. Your eyes, your smile, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. You're smart and strong and independent. Everything I could never become." And it made me remember that day Michelle showed up at our door. It made me remember how weak I was, how I chose to stay in a marriage with a man who'd betrayed me rather than have the courage to leave. I stared at her comprehension dawning with horrible clarity. "You didn't hate me. You hated yourself." Carol dissolved into sobs. "I poured all my love into Tom because if I didn't love that boy, what was the point? If I didn't make his life perfect, then what had I sacrificed my dignity for? But you..." She looked at me with eyes full of decades of pain and regret. "You were a reminder of the choice I made. Every time you succeeded, every time you built something on your own, every time you showed the strength I never had, it was like looking in a mirror and seeing everything I'd failed to become. The slap, the demands, the years of feeling invisible. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. So the slap that day," I said quietly, "wasn't really about the penthouse, was it?" Carol shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, it was because I envied you. You became the woman I never dared to be. You left. You built a life. You didn't let anyone control you. And in that moment, when you refused me in front of all those people, I saw how free you were. And I hated you for it, because I've never been free a single day of my life." I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady, my mind reeling from everything she'd told me. 48 years of my life suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. I wasn't unloved because I was unlovable. I was resented because I represented everything my mother had lost when she chose to stay in a broken marriage. Thank you for telling me the truth, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But I need time to process this. I turned toward the church door, toward the sunlight streaming through the entrance, towards something that felt like air after being underwater too long. Linda, please, Carol's voice cracked behind me. Please, don't tell Tom. He doesn't need to know. It would destroy him. I paused at the threshold, one hand on the heavy wooden door, and looked back at my mother, hunched in the pew, smaller and more broken than I'd ever seen her. I forgive you for being broken, Mum, I said quietly. I forgive you for being trapped in a life you didn't know how to leave. But I can't forget what you did. I can't pretend those 48 years didn't happen, that the pain wasn't real, that the damage can just be erased, because now I understand why. I stepped out into the sunlight, pulling the door closed behind me, and the fresh air hit my face like a benediction. My phone rang before I'd even reached my car, David's name on the screen. Linda, he said, his voice shaking with excitement, or fear, I couldn't tell which. I found something. Your father... He paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Linda, your father's been helping you all along. Continuation from part 12. The previous part ended with, I stepped out into the sunlight, pulling the door closed behind me, and the fresh air hit my face like a benediction. My phone rang before I'd even reached my car, David's name on the screen. Linda, he said, his voice shaking with excitement or fear, I couldn't tell which. I found something. Your father. He paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Linda, your father's been helping you all along. Current context of Linda has just left St. Mary's Church after her mother's devastating confession. She's learned that Tom is not her biological brother, but the product of her father's affair, and that her mother's lifetime of resentment toward her stemmed from Carol's own self-hatred and trapped circumstances. Linda is emotionally overwhelmed. Everything she thought she understood about her family has been recontextualized. She's processing decades of pain through a new lens that makes her mother's abuse understandable, though not excusable. She's standing in the church parking lot, still reeling, when David calls with this cryptic statement about her father helping her all along. Linda has been confused about her father's role throughout this entire ordeal. His cryptic phone call, his margin notes on documents, his strange look of relief when investigators came. Now she's about to get answers that will completely reframe her understanding of her father's actions. She's driving to David's office in a state of confused anticipation, not knowing whether to feel hope or dread about what she's about to learn. Jessica. I drove to David's office in a daze, my mother's confession still echoing in my head, mixing with David's words about my father helping me. Nothing made sense anymore. The family I thought I knew had been revealed as something else entirely, layer after layer, peeling back to expose truths I'd never imagined. David was waiting for me at his office door, and the moment I walked in, he guided me to his desk, where documents were spread across every available surface. Files I recognized, and files I'd never seen before. 6 months ago, David said without preamble, I received a package, no return address, postmarked from 2 towns over. Inside were copies of financial documents from Harris Construction, trust fund records, evidence of fraud going back 15 years. He pulled out a stack of papers, his hands moving with barely contained energy. I didn't know who sent them. I thought maybe it was an anonymous whistleblower, someone inside the company. But then, today, I was going through the files again, and I found this. He handed me a piece of paper folded small and tucked into one of the envelopes. I unfolded it with trembling hands and saw my father's handwriting. David, I know you're the only one who can help my daughter. Use these documents. Make sure she's free. Frank Harris. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. He sent you this 6 months ago before the wedding. 6 months before Tom's wedding, David confirmed. He was planning this long before any of us knew what was coming. Look at this. He pulled out another sheet, this one longer, written on Harris Construction letterhead. This was included in the same package. I read my father's careful script. If I tell her directly, she won't trust me. She'll think I'm manipulating her, that this is another form of control. She needs to discover the truth herself through someone she trusts. Only then will she truly be free. Only then will she have the power to choose what happens next, not as my daughter, but as her own person. My legs went weak and I sat down heavily in David's chair. He knew I wouldn't believe him. After 40 years of standing by while Mum hurt me after signing all those documents, after everything he knew, I'd never trust anything he told me directly. So he used me as an intermediary, David said quietly. Someone you'd helped, someone you trusted, someone with the legal knowledge to understand what the documents meant. He orchestrated the entire thing so that you would uncover the truth on your own terms. I remembered the phone call after I'd confronted him about the trust fund. "Do you trust me?" he'd asked, and I'd said no. And he'd said, "One day you will." "At the Penthouse," I whispered when the investigators came. He said, "So, it's finally over." He wasn't surprised. He was relieved. He'd been waiting for that moment. David nodded and began pulling out documents, showing me the margin notes we'd seen before, but now with new understanding. Every signature my father had made on fraudulent paperwork was accompanied by tiny handwritten notes. "This is wrong. Carol insists." "Forgive me, Linda. I should have stopped this." Dozens of them scattered across 15 years of documents. He wasn't just participating, David said. He was documenting. Every single document he signed, he made extra copies with these notes. He was building evidence, Linda, not to hide the fraud, but to expose it. He was creating a paper trail that would protect you when the time came. I picked up one of the documents, staring at my father's familiar handwriting in the margins. The implications crashed over me like waves. Why didn't he just stop it if he knew it was wrong? If he wanted to protect me, why not just refuse to sign? Why not tell Carol? No. David pulled out the final piece of paper, another letter in my father's hand. He explains it here. I read through tears. I was a coward. For 40 years, I told myself I was keeping the peace, that I was protecting the family, that things would get better if I just waited. But the truth is, I was too afraid to lose Carol, even though by staying silent, I'd already lost you. When I saw you pulling away completely, when I realised you might never speak to us again, I understood if I don't act now, I'll lose you forever. This is my last chance to do right by you. I can't undo the past, but I can make sure you have the evidence you need to be free. I'm so sorry it took me 40 years to find the courage to help you. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. But please know that I see you, Linda. I've always seen you. And you are the best thing I ever did in this life. I couldn't stop crying. David handed me tissues and waited silently while I tried to compose myself. He sacrificed his own honour, I finally managed to say. He let himself go down for fraud, knowing the investigation would destroy him because it was the only way to set me free. He couldn't just tell me the truth and expect me to believe him. He had to give me the power to uncover it myself, to make my own choices about what to do with it. David nodded. He's not a hero, Linda. He stood by for too long, signed documents he knew were wrong, let your mother hurt you for decades. But in the end, he tried to make it right the only way he knew how. I thought I was getting revenge, but I was wrong. I wasn't the hunter I was being set free. And the person who freed me was the one I thought had abandoned me all along. The 2 weeks after learning about my father's plan were strange and quiet. I went to work, met with clients, lived my life in the penthouse that had been the centre of so much conflict. But everything felt different now, like I was seeing the world through new eyes. The anger that had fueled me for so long had transformed into something else. Not quite peace, but maybe understanding. Maybe the beginning of healing. When Tom called asking to meet, I almost said no. But something in his voice, a humility I'd never heard before, made me agree. He and Emma arrived together that evening, and the moment I opened the door, I saw that Emma's hand was firmly clasped in his. They came in quietly, and without a word, both of them sank to their knees in my living room. "Sis," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I was blind to what Mum and Dad did to you all these years. I was comfortable and spoiled, and I never questioned why everything came so easily to me while you struggled. I should have seen it. I should have protected you." "Sis." Emma knelt beside him, her eyes red like she'd been crying for days. "We both want to apologise. I believed the things Carol said about you, and I should have known better. I should have questioned why a mother would speak about her own daughter that way." "Stand up," I said softly. "Please. You don't need to kneel." But before they could rise, there was another knock at my door. I opened it to find my mother standing in the hallway, and I barely recognised her. Her hair hung limp and unstyled, her face bare of makeup, her clothes simple and wrinkled. The proud, controlled woman from the wedding had been replaced by someone who looked small and defeated and very, very old. Without speaking, she walked past me into the living room and lowered herself to her knees beside Tom and Emma. Her hands were shaking as she pulled a small velvet box from her pocket and held it out to me. "This is your earring from that day," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I had it repaired." I took the box with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was the gold hoop that had flown across the marble floor when my mother struck me, now polished and perfect, as if it had never been broken at all. "I'm sorry," Carol said, and tears streamed down her face. "I was wrong. About everything. I don't deserve to be your mother, I know that now. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry." I looked at the earring, this small circle of gold that had become a symbol of everything broken in our family. And now it was mended, even if the memory of how it broke could never be erased. "I forgive you," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I deserve to stop carrying all this pain around. I reached down and helped my mother stand. She was lighter than I expected, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'll forget," I continued, meeting her eyes. "What you did still happened. The years of hurt still matter. Forgiveness just means I'm choosing not to let it poison the rest of my life." Carol nodded, crying silently, and for the first time in my memory, she didn't try to justify herself or make excuses. She just accepted what I'd said and bowed her head. Tom stood too, helping Emma to her feet, and looked at me with an expression full of hope and fear. Can we still be family after everything? I thought about what I'd learnt in the church about Tom not being my biological brother, about the circumstances of his birth and the lies that had shaped both our lives. And I realised it didn't matter. Blood hadn't made us family. The shared history of growing up in the same broken house hadn't made us family. But this moment, this choice to face the truth together, this willingness to acknowledge pain and seek forgiveness, maybe that was what family really meant. "You're my brother, by choice, not by blood," I said, and managed a small smile. "And that's more valuable than any accident of genetics could ever be." Tom pulled me into a hug, and Emma joined us, and even my mother stood nearby, not quite part of the embrace, but present in a way she'd never been before. We stood there in my living room as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the floor, a family broken and reassembled into something new and uncertain, but maybe more honest than we'd ever been. As they left, there was another knock on the door. I opened it to find a courier holding a package, official looking and carefully wrapped. "Linda Harris?" he asked. "Yes? Sign here, please." I signed and took the package, closing the door behind me. The label was simple typed on plain paper for Linda from Dad. I set the package on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment before finding the courage to open it. Inside were 3 items carefully wrapped and labelled. The first was a manila folder containing divorce papers signed by my father and dated 6 months before Tom's wedding. I read through them with growing disbelief. Frank Harris had prepared to leave Carol Harris, had signed, everything had been ready to file. But the papers had never been submitted to the court. He'd held on to them, preparing for a freedom he never quite claimed. The second item made my breath catch. A check for $500,000 made out to me with a memo line that read, "You're 20 years back. Build your real family now." The third was a letter several pages long, written in my father's careful script. My hands shook as I unfolded it. "Linda, I was a coward. I let your mother hurt you because I was too ashamed at him to face my own mistakes. But I always knew you were the strongest of us all. This money, I saved it from the moment you sent the first dollar. Carol never knew. I secretly set aside every remittance you sent, keeping it in a separate account. I want you to have it back when you are ready to leave us behind. You don't owe us forgiveness. You don't owe us anything. But I owe you an apology I'll never be brave enough to say in person. Go build the life you deserve far from us. Love, Dad. P.S. The penthouse was always yours. Don't let anyone tell you different." I read the letter 3 times, crying through each one before I finally understood what my father had done. He'd saved my money. Every dollar I'd sent home thinking it was helping my family, he'd secretly preserved. Not for himself, not for Tom, but for me. For the day when I would finally be free to claim it back. 6 months later, I stood on a small stage in a hotel ballroom downtown, looking out at 200 faces. The Harris Foundation's inaugural scholarship ceremony had drawn local press, education advocates, and 10 young women whose lives were about to change. "These scholarships," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and clear, "are for women from difficult family circumstances who want to build careers in fields where they've been told they don't belong. We're here to say you belong everywhere you have the courage to go." As I called each recipient's name and handed them their award, I saw their faces light up with hope and possibility. I saw myself in each of them, young women who'd been told they weren't enough, who'd been overlooked or underestimated or hurt by the people who should have protected them. In the front row, Emma and Aunt June applauded enthusiastically, June wiping away proud tears. And in the back corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood my father. He looked older, greyer, worn down by legal proceedings and the weight of his choices. But he was there watching me with tears streaming down his face. Our eyes met across the crowded room. I nodded slightly. He nodded back. No words were needed. This was his apology made real through my freedom. This was his redemption, not in being forgiven, but in seeing that his daughter had survived and transformed her pain into something that would help others. That evening, I stood on my penthouse balcony, watching the city lights blur and sharpen in the darkness. I held the small velvet box containing the repaired earring my mother had returned, symbol of the worst moment of my life, now mended, but never forgotten. I opened the box once more, looked at the gold hoop gleaming in the light, then closed it and placed it in a drawer, not thrown away, but put aside, acknowledged but no longer defining me. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find June, Emma, and David standing there with pizza boxes and wine bottles and smiles. "We're celebrating," June announced, pushing past me into the penthouse. The foundation's launch was perfect. "You're changing lives," Emma added, following her in. David brought up the rear, grinning. "And we're your family now, whether you like it or not." I looked at these 3 people who'd stood by me, who'd helped me find the truth, who'd chosen to be in my life not because of obligation or blood, but because of genuine care and respect. My penthouse, once a symbol of lonely independence, filled with their laughter and warmth and the sound of actual family. Yes, or stores, I said, closing the door behind them. Yes, you are. For the first time in my life, I wasn't my parents' daughter. I wasn't the girl who had to prove herself. I was simply Linda, and that was more than enough. Closing. If Linda's story moved you, if you found yourself thinking about your own family dynamics, or the courage it takes to stand up for yourself, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? What would you have done in Linda's situation? Would you have forgiven your parents, or would you have walked away completely? This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful act isn't revenge, it's reclaiming your own narrative and building the life you deserve. Linda didn't just expose the truth, she transformed her pain into purpose by creating a foundation that will help countless other women escape toxic family situations and build independent lives. But here's the question I want you to think about. Was Linda right to involve the authorities knowing it would destroy her parents' lives? Or should she have handled it privately within the family? There's no easy answer, and I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life accounts of family drama, betrayal, redemption, and people finding the courage to stand up for themselves, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We share stories every week about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding their way to the other side. And if you know someone who needs to hear Linda's story, someone who's struggling with family dysfunction, or feeling invisible in their own life, please share this video with them. Sometimes we need to hear about someone else's journey to find the courage to start our own. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, you are not defined by the family you were born into. You are defined by the choices you make and the life you build for yourself. Just like Linda, you are enough exactly as you are. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself and don't be afraid to choose your own happiness.